So in front of you, there is a book, and it's called the Bible in one of the pews. So if you want, I would suggest that you try to find First Kings. It's in the first half of the book somewhere. And we'll be at chapter 18. I'll just let those who are hunting and pecking to wait a minute until you're there, and then I'll begin. All right. So again, as I said, we're going to be looking at this question that arises in chapter 19, and it's, what are you doing here? And so in my introduction, I would like to just go over the 4 areas that we're going to be covering this morning. The first one, we're going to take a brief look at the awkward situation that we find Elijah, or that Elijah finds himself in as he runs for his life. We're going to look at what was his motivation and reason for running away. Second, we're going to look into the question he's asked by the angel of Adonai and by Adonai himself. What are you doing here, Elijah? Third, we're going to be looking at the question itself. Like, does this question by Adonai have any relevance in our lives today? And then finally, conclusion, and along with the conclusion, a mini application. So just before I go on, a little bit of backstory here. We're going to be looking at Ahab and Jezebel. King Ahab, also spelled Echab, was the 7th king of the northern kingdom of Israel. He was the son of Omri. And in 1 Kings 16:30, it says that he was considered more evil than all who were before him. So not only was he evil, but the wonderful woman he decided to marry was not exactly a real princess either. King Ahab sought to create a pact with the neighboring Tyrian, or Tyre, the kingdom, and he married the king's daughter. Her name, of course, Jezebel, and was the daughter of, this is an interesting name because of what the whole story is about. The king's name was Et-Baal, interesting, king of Tyrian Empire. So automatically there's a connection, as you see from the very beginning of the father's name, of where Jezebel and her whole push of serving Baal and Ashtaroth comes from. It's almost in the very name of her father. So just a brief sort of background. We're going to jump into 1 Kings 17. And this is all about how Elijah was being led by God. And so these are God tells Elijah something. So in 17, God tells Elijah to go tell Ahab it's not going to rain for 3 years. There's lots of reasons why, but I'm not going to go into it right now. But then God tells Elijah to hide by the Wadi Cherith, and ravens come and feed him. Now, this is an important point. I'll come back to it later because of what happens very soon. And then God tells Elijah to go to Zarephath. Remember the widow at Zarephath? This is the time of the drought, the 3 years. And he asks her, give me something to eat. And she goes, I have enough for a meal and I'm dead. Basically, there's no more left. And from that story, if you remember, for 3 years, the oil and the flour never run out. Okay, so remember, this is God telling Elijah where to go, what to do, and he's obeying. And now we jump to 1 Kings 18, and we see God tells Elijah to tell Ahab rain's coming. All right. And God then tells Elijah how to show Israel that he alone is God as he removes the prophets of Baal and Ashtaroth. These were the prophets that were fed and protected by Jezebel. In verse 36 of 18, it says, now it was the time of offering up the evening sacrifice, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that Elijah the prophet came near and said, Adonai. Now remember, before this, the prophets of Baal, since the morning until 3 o'clock, have been jumping around, cutting themselves with knives and swords, splitting blood, calling down their little god to put fire on their burnt offering, their sacrifice. Nothing happens. So now Elijah steps up and he builds the altar, 12 stones representing the 12 tribes. Remember, he digs a moat, he fills it with water, puts water all over the thing. And then he says, of course, the words, Adonai, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. I have done all these things at your word. So again, we see God is telling Elijah exactly what to do. And of course, you know the story, fire comes down, consumes everything. And then Elijah and remember he says to Israel, those who are for me, those who are against me. And then they slaughter the 800 prophets and priests. So there's 450, maybe 850. There's 450, I think, of Baal and 400 of Ashtaroth that are killed. Then God's hand is on Elijah, and he outruns Ahab to Jezreel. Remember, as soon as this happens, Ahab takes off. He's going to Jezreel. That's where they're living. And now God puts his hand on Elijah, and he outruns Ahab to Jezreel. And this is where the story gets a little weird in the sense that now the hand of Adonai was on Elijah, so he girded up his loins and outran Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. Now, Elijah must have been told to go to Jezreel. Why would he go to Jezreel? Right? He just murdered 850 prophets of Baal. Ahab is now not his friend, and Ahab's on his way back to see his wife. But God somehow tells him to go, and he outruns Ahab. So here we are. So Adonai this is speculation, but must have had a plan for Elijah in Jezreel to send him there. So the first point I want to look at then, getting back to the point, there's a little backstory here. What was Elijah's motivation and reason for running? Well, in 19 verse 1, it says this, then Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Now remember, it wasn't just Elijah killing, it was Israel that was there. He had gathered all of Israel, and they also participated, but that's not how the story comes across when he tells Jezebel. Then Jezebel, in verse 2, sent a messenger to Elijah. Again, remember, he's in Jezreel. And she says to him, so let the gods do to me, and worse, if by this time tomorrow, I don't make your life like the life of one of them. In other words, I'm going to slay you, just like you slayed my prophets, I'm going to slay you. So the motivation then, he's frightened. It says in verse 3, frightened, he got up and ran for his life. Remember, Elijah had just watched God slay all the priests and prophets of Baal and Ashtaroth by the word and the power of God. And he wasn't afraid, even though Ahab was there. And remember a little further back, I was talking about when he told Ahab there was going to be no rain. Well, God told him to go to that place and feed him because his life was in danger. He wasn't afraid of Ahab. He confronts him, he talks to him. Why was Elijah so afraid of Jezebel? My thought is that Jezebel was slaughtering all the prophets of Adonai. As we'll see, his whole point is, I'm the only one left. So in his mind, he has this, remember, we'll get to it in a minute. I'll come back to it because it's just his mindset is he's so overtaken by fear that he's not thinking straight. And that should be something for us as well, too. It's a connection for us that when we lose sight, sometimes we do things on our own. And we'll see in a moment what happens. And then there's a really strange encounter. The chapter sort of takes a left or right turn, and Ahab and Obadiah, his servant, they need grazing ground for their cattle. So Ahab says to Obadiah, you go that way, I'll go this way. So as Obadiah is going that way, and Ahab's gone the other way, there's an encounter with Elijah. And in 1 Kings 18:3, it says this, Ahab summoned Obadiah, who was the steward of the palace. Now Obadiah feared Adonai greatly. For when Jezebel was cutting off the prophets of the prophets of Adonai, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them in 2 caves, 15 each, and he fed them with water and bread, it says. So Obadiah is on the side of God. In 10 of 18, it says, as Adonai your God lives. Now, this is the conversation now between Elijah and Obadiah, because Elijah meets Obadiah and has a message for him to tell Ahab. Because as Adonai your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my master has not sent to search for you. And when they said, he's not here, he made that kingdom or nation swear that they could not find you. Now, look, this is an oath. So Ahab is desperately searching for Elijah, wants to kill him. Jezebel wants to kill him. And so he's gone to every nation that they know of, and he's put them underneath a bond or an oath that if for some reason Ahab finds out that they did hide him, that nation would be destroyed. Okay, so this is the sort of the scenario that we're looking at here. Notice in verse 4, though, it states that it was Jezebel that was killing the prophets. But in verse 10, it says, my master is referring to Ahab. So the question then is, could this imply that the true power was held by Jezebel? Or was Ahab just as nasty, just as awful and cruel as Jezebel? I would say yes to both. Could be why Elijah thought he was the only prophet left. Could be. In 1 Kings 18:12, it says, but, this is Obadiah now, he's fearing now for his life. It says, as soon as I leave you, the Ruach Adonai may carry you off where I don't know. Then I wouldn't know. Then when I come and tell Ahab and he can't find you, he'll kill me. What a strange thing for him to say. I was reading this and I thought, so had this happened before? You know, had they come up to Elijah one time and boom, he's gone? It reminds me, you remember Philip? He comes down, talks to the Ethiopian, they go down, they dip in the water. Next thing he finds himself in the Zostos. You know, he's gone. And just the way that Obadiah is saying here, yeah, sure, you're going to tell me to go tell Ahab, and then right, as soon as I tell him, you're gone. And then I'm dead. I'm not doing that. And so there's this contradiction, and yet there's this understanding of the power and that God's in all of this, because Obadiah obviously goes back and tells Ahab, and Elijah does confront him. So then the conclusion to the first question is, as stated earlier, it was Elijah's fear of man that caused him to run. He took his eyes off the Lord. Running for his life. As we pick up in verse 19, 3b, it says, when he came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, he left his servant there, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom bush. Now, it's interesting. I was going to put a map of Israel up, and I didn't, but if you ever seen a map of Israel, you see where the Sea of Galilee is. Well, just above the Sea of Galilee, almost directly north a little bit, is there's a Jezreel Valley that comes down, and Jezreel is here, and off to the seaside is where Mount Carmel is, where he just killed the prophets of Baal and all that. So he runs to Jezreel. So now from Jezreel, we go all the way south into the Negev to Beersheba. Now, if you know anything about Beersheba or Beersheba, This is where Abraham and Abimelech had this quarrel over a well that was dug. If you remember, he brought 7 lambs, and Abimelech says, what do these 7 lambs mean? And it was a swearing time saying, this is my well. And Abimelech says, yes, I agree. You dug the well, it's your well. So this is where Beersheba, the well of 7 or the well of oath, this is where this town, its name, it comes from. Isaac also built an altar in Beersheba. Jacob had his dream about a stairway to heaven after leaving Beersheba. So he too, not in Beersheba, but a little further away, had this dream and saw the stairway to heaven. The sons of prophets of Samuel were judges in Beersheba, and Saul, Israel's first king, built a fort there for his campaign against the Amalekites. Now it's interesting, he sat down under a broom tree. This is the broom tree. And it says here in verse 4, he comes to the tree, and I'm thinking he leaves Beersheba and goes a day's journey. He wants to be by himself. Perhaps he knows about Jacob and being away from Beersheba and, the stairway to heaven. We don't know, but he goes away from Beersheba a day's journey, and he sits under a tree and he prays. And his prayer, as you see here, is that he might die. It's too much, he said. Now, Adonai, take my life, for I'm no better than my father's. See, fear had so gripped him that he lost all hope, and he felt he had failed. Like Peter's fear when he was walking on water. Remember, he's walking on water, and all of a sudden he looked at the clouds and he started to sink. Oh, and Yeshua grabs him and picks him. Oh, Peter. But he got out of the boat. But again, Elijah the same way. He took his eyes off of Adonai. He took his eyes off what his purpose, his calling was. And so we see him here, his prayer to God. And what's really interesting is that God answers him right away. Well, at least the scripture. We don't know the time frame, but it seems like it's right away. And it says, then he lay down and he slept under the broom bush. Then behold, an angel touched him and said to him, get up and eat. So he looked, and to his surprise, there by his head was a cake baked on hot stones, a jar of water. So he ate and drank and went back to bed. Does that not seem strange to you? An angel of the Lord wakes him up. There's food, he eats. Maybe the angel disappeared, I don't know. And he goes back to bed, or back to sleep, actually, not to bed. Then the angel of Adonai came again, a second time, touched him and said, get up and eat. But this time there's a reason. Because the journey is too much for you. This is where it gets interesting. Was Elijah proceeding to his original destination, or was he told by the Ruach? And in a way, Beersheba is far enough away from Jezreel that he feels somewhat secure, somewhat safer than he was up north. So Adonai is, I believe, Adonai is more than able to know the mind and thoughts of a person. I believe it was his prayer to Adonai that set what was to come next to go because of the ensuing question. So he arose, ate and drank, and in the strength of that meal, 40 days and 40 nights went to Horeb, or Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. So what's the significance of Horeb? Well, if you remember, this is where Moses saw the burning bush and heard God's voice. God commanded Moshe to strike the rock and obtain water. On Mount Horeb, God made a covenant with his people, Israel, and God handed down the 10 commandments in the Torah. The people made a golden idol in the shape of a calf to worship. Maybe Elijah thought that he would be safe at Horeb, or that he would be able to hear God more clearly. We don't know. that leads me to the second question, or the second point, and that is, what is the question? Look at the question that he's asked by the angel of Adonai. And the Adonai himself. And the interesting thing here is that this is what he does. So he arrives at Horeb and he finds a cave. And it says, when he arrived there, at the cave, he spent the night there. So we don't have the backstory here. Did he know there was a cave here? Did he come to Mount Horeb and find a cave and decided to stay there the night? We don't know. My supposition is that he knew there was a cave there and he went there, and he's in the cave for protection. And there's no reason anywhere in the commentaries that, I mean, there's nothing in scripture that tells, there's nothing that's written to tell us. So if he did know it was there, he probably thought it was the greatest place to hide, to be safe. Then, behold, the word of Adonai came to him. He said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Here's Elijah's answer. Verse 10. "I've been very zealous for Adonai Tsevaot, the Lord of the armies." He said, "For the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and slain your prophets with the word. And I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it." Sounds like a cry for protection. Oh God, help me. Then he said, the angel, "Come out and stand on the mount before Adonai." This is where things get interesting. But behold, Adonai was passing by. A great and mighty wind was tearing at the mountains with a sword, and shattering the cliffs before Adonai. But Adonai was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake. Terrific. But Adonai was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire. But Adonai was not in the fire. After the fire was a soft whisper of a voice. It's interesting to see what Elijah does. As soon as Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle, went out, and stood at the entrance of the cave. Remember at the beginning of this, the angel told him, stand out on the thing. He never moved. He stayed in the cave. All this stuff happened, and then he heard the still small voice, covered his face, and stepped out into the presence of God. Oh, how I wish that happened more frequently, that we could call upon him and we could stand in his presence, humbled and in his presence. Notice it was only when he heard the still small voice that he came out. Then all of a sudden, a voice addressed him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It's the same rhetoric he said before. "I've been very zealous for Adonai Tsevaot, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and slain your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they are seeking to take my life." The pulpit commentary sort of moved some scales from my eyes, and it gave me a different perspective of this interaction. It says, when it is remembered that the prophet had been sent to every other destination by the word of the Lord, and that he had left Jezreel without any such word. He left it in terror, in bitter disappointment, and in distrust of God. It does look as if the question conveyed a gentle reminder that he had deserted his post of duty and had no right to be there. Teaching English in China, I used to do this in class all the time. I just move the stress a little way, and it changes the question. It changes the resulting answers. So if we move the stress of the question, I think we can see this more clearly. So the way it's originally read is, what are you doing here, Elijah? The implication is like, what's the reason? Right? And Elijah takes it that way and he says, well, they were killing me and all the prophets and I'm going to die and help me. That's his answer. That's how he hears the question. But what if we change the stress? What if I change it like this? What are you doing here, Elijah? That implies you're not supposed to be here. Like, you're not invited. When you say to somebody, what are you doing here? It's a different response. It's like, who invited you? You're not supposed to be here. But what if we change the stress to the last one? What are you doing here, Elijah? Well, that changes things a little. By moving the stress to the question, I believe it makes it much clearer as to why both the angel and Adonai asked Elijah this question. So why did you leave? Implied, did I tell you to leave? Why did you come here? Did I tell you to go here? Why didn't you seek my face in Jezreel? Implied, don't you think I would have answered you there? Why were you afraid? Implied, don't you trust me? I believe the most important point of this interaction is Adonai's response to Elijah, albeit at a different location than Jezreel. But Adonai listens to Elijah's excuse. Rather than correction, Adonai gives him a new set of commands. God tells Elijah, go see these three people. Anoint this one as king, anoint this one, and by the way, there's your replacement. Anoint him too. Okay? So God's not finished with Elijah, but he doesn't rebuke him. He just gives him a new set of commands. And Elijah goes, okay. And he goes on. So does this then, we must remember that even in Elijah's moment of despair and fear, he did cry out to Adonai, right? When he was in Beersheba, he under the tree, he came out and he poured his heart out. So that leads us to the third part of our message today, and is, does this question by Adonai have any relevance in our lives today? I believe this question is very relevant for us. It gives us hope that if we abandon Adonai, what Adonai has commanded us to do when we are overwhelmed with fear or despair, he won't abandon us. Second, it gives us hope that when we cry out to him, he will hear and respond. It gives us hope that there is a next, even after failure. So in conclusion then, as we've read, Elijah, one of the greatest prophets, succumbs to the fear of man. Yet this man of God continues on. In fact, if you know the end of the story, he's taken up in a chariot of fire, or in a whirlwind, not in a chariot of fire. He's taken up in a whirlwind. So he's in the presence of God. So we know that this was not a blight on his following Adonai. Yes, he ran out of fear for his life, but Adonai restores him and uses him continually. I mean, if you read Elijah and Elisha, they did some amazing things for God. And I believe it's the same with us. If our heart is to serve him, even in failure, when we press into him, he answers, he responds, he strengthens, he gives us a new, I would say not object, but a new purpose in life, a new goal, a new area to go to. And so, like Elijah, we too are susceptible of the same fate. It is when we call out to Adonai, as he did, that we can trust he will strengthen, restore, and lead us onward. That's my hope. And that's my message. May the Lord bless you. Baruch haba b'Shem Adonai. Amen.